The Whiz Kids had won it, Bobby Thompson had done it, and Yogi read the comics all the while. Rock and roll was being born, marijuana we would scorn. So down on the corner, the national pastime went on trial. We're talking baseball,
The Comfortably Zoned Radio Network proudly presents Genesis with Ian Kahanowitz and Marc Weiss.
My baby dolls, I'm back again. Unfortunately, I don't have my co-pilot, the master of disaster, the mean man of swing is not with me, Marc Weiss. He unfortunately had a surgery yesterday, and he'll be back hopefully next week or the week after when his vocal cords are back. But as always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz. You're listening to Genesis on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man himself, Ralph Tycho. And today, folks, I got a great author coming back to the show. He was on my show last year. Probably one of the most important topics we can talk about is the baseball union and how the pendulum shifted from owners to players. It's all documented in author Krister Swanson's Baseball Power Shift, how the players union, the fans, the media changed American sports culture. He's going to be on in a second. I cannot stop praising this book. It gives a general overview about the last, say, 150 years of how things have gone when it came to players' rights, and then finally up to Marvin Miller. Today's discussion, we're going to basically focus on Marvin Miller and about the time of his reign from about 1966 to 1982 as the players' general manager of the union representatives. I think that's it. But anyway, welcome to the show, Krister Swanson. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Ian. Thanks.
All right, and now let me ask you this. How long, because this book is very, very detailed, how long did it take you to research for this?
Well, the initial push was for my dissertation at the University of California at Santa Barbara in 20th century U.S. history. So about a 3-year initial push and then about 6 more years of kind of cleaning things up and tightening things down and really refining it so that it would be a book that people would find useful and really want to read. It was a real joy for sure to do it. I think 3 total trips back to Cooperstown. I'm not going to complain about that at all. Some time in the Big Apple, some great time in the archives at NYU looking at Marvin Miller's papers and those kinds of things. So really, you know, a labor of love for me for sure, because I came of age in the 70s. I fell in love with baseball in the early 70s as a 5-year-old. And, you know, those of us old enough to remember, right, remember that it kept getting interrupted. And as a young kid, so disappointed that the game I loved kept getting interrupted by strikes and lockouts and things like that. I think that question kind of always stayed with me. So when I got a chance to study 20th century labor history, I guess it's probably a natural progression that I came back around to the topic.
And, you know, what people don't realize is, because you mentioned New York, NYU, is that you're on the West Coast. You got your Ph.D. in modern American history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and you teach at Thousand Oaks High School in California, and you are a content developer for the union at the ABC CLIO Publishing, I think.
Right. They do a lot of great work in education, and so I do all kinds of history and government stuff for them and write commentary, usually about sports and pop culture and that kind of stuff. So a lot of if you have any listeners that are in education, they probably know ABC CLIO.
Yes. I didn't even know. I even pronounced it wrong.
Yeah, no, that's all right. It's kind of it's one of those things, Ian, that's well known for those who use it, kind of thing.
Well, let me ask you this, Krister. When you started thinking about doing a book, did you think it would be this vast, covering about 150 years of baseball between the players and the owners?
You know, I really didn't, and it wasn't until I really came to realize that the players, right from the very start, had sought a need to organize. You know, Major League Baseball has its roots in the 1870s and 1880s, And right from the start, the players found themselves very much at odds with the owners over some key issues related to their employment and their standard contract, especially the reserve clause, which I know we'll talk about a lot over the course of this show. And I had never understood that. I had never realized that there had been efforts by the players to unionize dating back to the late 1880s. Even to one point, where the players formed their own league. That's all preface, of course, for what we're going to talk about today. But certainly, I thought it was a story that was the story of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I didn't really have any idea that it would be so important to talk about, things that we've talked about before. Ian, as you mentioned, when I was on the show previously, we talked a lot about what happened in the 1890s and the early 1900s, 1920s, and then into the 40s, the post-war period, of course, being very important too, all really help set the stage for the part of the book that people usually enjoy the most, which, as you mentioned, is starting with chapter 4, and we bring Marvin Miller into the picture, and it really takes off from there.
And you know what brings light, because there was another book out there, and we can go into the whole thing of the 1890 whole thing where the players actually organized another league, and then they had their first day in court, and we could go into all that. But that's all the preface. The Federal League, which it was in the dead ball era, 1913 to 1915, tried to challenge Major League Baseball, and then that was brought into court. Let's talk about the reserve clause, and let's find out why courts were so reluctant to do away with the reserve clause, even though it just strikes up so much harm against the players, and it's pretty much a one-sided deal for the owners.
Yeah, so what the reserve clause basically did was once a player signed a major league contract, they were bound to the team that they signed the contract with basically for life. And the reason for that was that the team had the first rights to re-sign the player for the next season. So really you only had one buyer of your skills, so to speak, at the end of every year. The only terms by which you would be able to choose your own team to move on to is if that team released you. And, of course, they would only release you if your value was falling. So players were never able to negotiate from a position of strength. They were never able to, at the peak of their career, go out and say, all right, who's willing to pay the most for my services? Who's willing to make the most attractive offer to me? Teams, of course, liked this, and they made many arguments. You mentioned the courts. They make a lot of arguments in the courts for why baseball was an exception. Of course, we know at one point they actually, and still have really, an exception from antitrust regulation. They're still allowed to operate in that way. But the owners would continually make these arguments. A series of trade wars had made them leery of competition. So, of course, like a lot of businesses, they wanted freedom to operate in a monopolistic environment if they could. And they could. They figured out a way to win that right in the courts and use the reserve clause really to keep the players under their thumb. Anybody who's ever worked a day in their life can imagine going into that moment where you're deciding your compensation and realizing that you only have one possible employer and they're sitting across the table from you. That being the situation, then the owners, of course, got very good at a variety of different tricks that they would use to try and keep player salaries as low as possible. I know the business model of the game has really changed. It's very complex now, all the advertising revenue, all the luxury seat revenue, all the television revenue. But if your listeners can imagine a time period where the business model was really pretty simple. You made money selling tickets to games, and you made some money on concessions, beer and pretzels and hot dogs and that kind of thing. And then you spent money on players, and you spent a little bit of money getting your players from place to place. And, of course, you had to have grounds to play on and all those kinds of things, but really a very simple model. And so the player salaries were a huge piece of that. They were a huge piece of the cost structure, and so owners wanted to keep that as low as possible. I think any of us that's ever been a business owner can certainly understand that desire. You want to keep your costs as low as possible. The problem in this case, of course, is that it was a serious infringement on the rights of the players, and you know, called into question the 13th Amendment and involuntary servitude and all kinds of other things. But courts, time and again, looked at the situation and said, this is not a violation of the 13th Amendment. Baseball is an exception from all these antitrust regulations. And the reserve clause was allowed to stand, again, because of a series of time-tested arguments the owners would make about the need to maintain competitive balance and those kinds of things. The irony is, of course, and Ian, I can't remember if you're a Yankee fan or not, so I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your toes here. You are. Okay. So not to rain on your parade, but any good Yankee fan knows how many rings they won through the era before free agency. Certainly George Steinbrenner and the Yankees since free agency have been very good in the free agency era, but they were perhaps at their best before free agency, which pretty much went against one of the owner's biggest arguments for the reserve clause, which was they felt without the reserve clause, all the wealthy clubs would win all the championships. Well, you know, Ian, how well the Yankees did through the 20s and then again through the 50s and at various other times when the reserve clause was in place. So really the Yankees' success right there kind of set aside the whole idea that wealthy clubs could not still do well in the era with the reserve clause. And what the Yankees were especially good at, besides developing their own talent, was buying talent from other teams. Even with the reserve clause in place, a wealthy club still had a huge advantage because they could buy contracts from other teams. So that's a little bit of an introduction for folks who may not have grown up with a reserve clause like we did.
And, you know, there's two instances that stick out. They stick out to so many more. You know, you had the 46 thing, you got the Federal League stuff, and then going into it. But two things stick out to me. When the Federal League was created, baseball had to be competitive in their salaries, and so they jacked up. They gave more to be competitive with the Federal League, but as soon as the Federal League died, players like Casey Stengel, they got less money because the owners know they had a monopoly on them.
Right. They could just crack back down. So every time a trade war popped up, like the Federal League war, or even when the American League came into being, right, in the very early 1900s, there would be a war, which the players liked initially because there would always be a bump in salaries, like you said, Ian. But then as soon as it got resolved and as soon as the one league got beat out or the leagues would merge and agree to a common national agreement, salaries would come right back down. And in many cases down lower than they were previously. Again, because the owners held all the bargaining power, and again, because they were so good at establishing a paternalistic kind of relationship with the players, where the players were really just willing to take whatever they could get, essentially, from the owners. The players became very dependent on the owners. And that, of course, really suppressed salaries, made things great for the owners in terms of cost certainty and those kinds of things, but really limited opportunities and limited the rights of the players in the process.
You mentioned the Yankees before free agency. We're going to go into that right now. George Weiss, that's the general manager of the Yankees. Through all those great championships of the 50s up until the early 60s, Yogi Berra won the MVP 3 times, and the year he didn't win it, he was docked, and he hit over 300.
Yep.
That's the kind of leverage. And these guys, I got to mention, they had to have off-season jobs. You know, Berra worked in an Italian restaurant. A lot of the players were laborers because they couldn't make ends meet with the stuff with the salaries the owners were giving them.
Right, absolutely. And that's, I think we have grown so accustomed, right, to this thing where even sort of an average minor league, well, I shouldn't say that about the guys in the minor leagues, but any prospect who gets a decent amount of signing money or whatever, you know, baseball becomes their full-time job right from the start. They don't have to worry about the expanded costs of maintaining households in 2 places and the idea that they're going to have to work. Remember, a lot of guys, too, started families younger back then, and so they would have a family at home, so to speak, and then they would need to maintain a household wherever they were playing. And that certainly, and we're talking again about big leaguers now. We're not talking about minor leaguers. Through most of the history I write about in the book, you're absolutely right, Ian. These guys worked whatever jobs they could to make money in the off season. So this idea of off season training, the kinds of things that guys are able to do now in terms of strength and conditioning, you know, time to just kind of relax and unwind, whatever, was not really a thing. So which kind of, I think, perpetuated, and this is kind of interesting. I hadn't really thought of it in these terms before, but I wonder if a fair amount of the public attitude at the time was, because, you know, they've always fought the impression that baseball is not work, it's a game. These are grown men being paid to play a kid's game. And I wonder if the fact that so many of them worked off-season jobs, like you said, as laborers or in restaurants or those kinds of things, fed that public perception that they were really just grown-ups playing a kid's game, which was one of the things the owners constantly reminded people of every time the players asked for any kind of equality or expansion of rights or anything like that.
And that is exactly right. And those arguments were made a lot during the turmoil of labor in the turn of the century, during the dead ball era. You guys are playing a kid's game. You don't have to be in the factories through the hot summer. You're out on a ball field. Now, I think Kaminsky, part of the reasons why we had a Black Sox scandal in 1919 is that Kaminsky wasn't paying his players. If anything, he was paying his players the cheapest out of all clubs. And these guys needed more money. And, they called them the Black Sox for two reasons. One, their uniforms were dirty, and Kaminsky didn't want to pay for it, so he wanted the players to pay for it. And two, the whole scandal, which was rooted right from Kaminsky's cheapness, that these guys had to go out and make money by betting on their own team in the World Series.
Right. Yeah, no, he was just one of many who are well known for being pretty tight-fisted all the way around.
And so, you got that. Mike, I know I asked you this question before, but I'm going to save it for later. Why you didn't hear much rumblings in the 20s and 30s, probably during the Golden Age, but you started hearing rumblings in the late 50s, and of course that whole debacle out in Los Angeles with Koufax and Drysdale, which really kick-started an interest in bringing in a Marvin Miller. Let's talk about what's going on in the late 50s and 60s in the Dodger incident.
Well, the growing thing that starts to happen is the players really start to realize the importance of a pension and the importance of a health care plan. And there's money available to pay for that. The money starts to come in the form of television, which, by the way, from my point of view, the owners badly mismanaged at first. And not totally, I understand why. They were in this model where, again, their revenue was all coming from having people come to the park. Well, if somebody's sitting home watching on TV, they're not going to come to the park. I totally get that fear. What the owners missed was the idea that if you use television to popularize the game, just like they'd used radio to popularize the game earlier, that would actually ultimately mean more for you, and that perhaps a big revenue stream would be charging networks for the right to broadcast what you had to offer. So they were slow on the uptake with that. There's some great stories about how cheaply they sold the rights to like the World Series and the All-Star Game and those kinds of things early on, and not negotiating any kind of real good national TV deal. But as that money started to become more significant, and I apologize for the barking dog in the background.
Don't worry about it.
As that money became more and more significant, the players started to say, well, that's how we should be funding the pension. That money should really be a part of the pension. And they realized that as that pot of money started to grow, the television money, that the owners were going to seek to grab as much of that as they could for themselves. And I think with that and sort of the growing rights consciousness, right, of the late 50s and the early 60s, and the players' sense that they really, a lot of the industrial unions, of course, at that point had won much better health care and pensions and those kinds of things. It became clear to the players they needed to do something to solidify their share of the TV money. And they came around to a place where they realized that they needed somebody who really had a strong background in labor negotiations, a strong background in building and maintaining a union. Because a lot of people don't realize that, many players were very opposed. They were very, in a sort of don't bite the hand that feeds you kind of thing. They knew how opposed the owners were to unionization. They knew how controversial this might be. And a big part of what I try to investigate in the book is how the public was going to respond. And there was a lot of public sentiment that was against any kind of union for baseball players. A lot of people really didn't want to think of baseball as any kind of business, even though it obviously was. And again, younger listeners, it's harder for them to picture, I'm sure, the way pro sports were when we grew up, these ideas that these teams were community treasures that had a duty almost to perform. And again, this idea they're so fortunate to play a game for a living, I think that's shifted with sort of our view of acceptable labor standards and all of those kinds of things. We find ourselves then in the early 60s with the players trying to figure out, well, how are we going to make this happen? And Robin Roberts and Jim Bunning were among a small group of players that said, hey, Robert Cannon, who's our current representative, is the owner's puppet. He's not going to do anything for us. Let's look in new directions. And that's when, in 1966, they bring Marvin Miller on the scene. You're absolutely right, Ian. That's right after or in the immediate wake of the Koufax-Drysdale holdout and all of those kinds of things, which is significant. The Koufax-Drysdale thing is significant because it shows us how players had started to realize their individual value. Remember, pitchers used to throw a lot more often back then. Excuse me. Koufax and Drysdale accounted for a huge amount of the Dodger wins and a huge amount of the Dodger attendance. And what they were asking for is almost laughable compared to what players of their caliber get paid now. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think they each settled for a little bit more than $100,000 a season, which
That's
even
right.
if you adjust for inflation is probably still just shy of $1 million each.
That's right.
For Koufax and Drysdale, who would be $30 million a season pitchers now.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, think of Clayton Kershaw and what he's earning. These guys who are legends, and you have two of them. You don't even have one holding up the team.
Right.
You know
Yeah. I mean right. Two Kershaws, not a Kershaw and a Greinke. Two Kershaws.
No.
I
two
like
Kershaws.
that. Yeah. Two Kershaws.
That's what it is. And now that whole debacle. Now let me ask you this. Let's get some background on Marvin Miller prior to coming to Major League Baseball, and let's talk about who invited him in, and let's talk about the tour, because like you mentioned, the players were wary, and so he wanted to make sure that the players felt comfortable doing this and what he was planning to do.
Right. So, again, it was a small players committee. Robin Roberts was really one of the hugest, he was a Philly, right? For most of his career?
It was.
Am I remembering that right, Ian?
Yeah,
that's
true.
Obviously, total, what we would call a total pro now, right? Somebody who really put in a lot of work, was very professional in the way he went about it, had a very long career with a lot of success. And Robin Roberts was a sharp guy. Really understood kind of the nature of work, the sort of limited time span in which most of his teammates were making their living, and I think realized that something needed to change to kind of secure the permanent benefits of this in terms of a pension and a health care plan. And so, he and Jim Bunning, of course, who later went on to become a U.S. Senator, were part of a small group of players that really started to push this idea that they needed really a player-controlled union and not an association. There already was an MLBPA, but it was sort of a puppet organization for the owners. It was a company union of sorts. Marvin Miller had worked for United Steelworkers for a very long time as an economist, and so he had some background both in the economics and in the organizing side of things. And when they bring Marvin Miller in, he does this spring training tour. That's the tour I believe you're referring to, Ian. And on his spring training tour, he has all kinds of resistance. He goes from clubhouse to clubhouse in both what we always used to call the cactus and grapefruit leagues, and I guess we still do, but they've sort of shifted and really redefined themselves, haven't they, in terms of who goes where?
They did.
But he started with the Cactus League clubs, if I remember correctly, and then went on to the Grapefruit League clubs, and almost everywhere, but especially like I remember clearly the Angels almost unanimously voted against him. Gene Autry was real anti-union, and he was the Angels owner, of course, and those Angels players just towed the line right there, and it took a while for Miller to start building momentum and getting support. As he made his way out to the Grapefruit League clubs, things started to improve a little bit. And eventually he was able to win the players over and help them see the importance of sort of changing the philosophy of the union and really starting to move to secure the pension benefits were huge up front. The pension benefits, the players' rights to their own likeness. Part of the standard contract was that the owners own the likeness they owned the likeness of the players, and the players wanted to win that back. And so there were all kinds of back and forth in those early years, and the book really gets into detail on this about how strategically those things played out. and how the playing card contract even became a part of this, or the trading card contract even became a part of this, because the standard Topps trading card contract made the reserve clause look like a joke. In terms of
That's right.
The players would sign initially for some ridiculously low amount of money, and then Topps basically owned them, and they could pay them a very small amount every year. And so the players actually started with Coca-Cola, a deal where they started putting player pictures, just their headshots, inside bottle caps. And they were able to use the revenue from that, from Coca-Cola, to fund the union offices, which is one of the things that allowed the union to break free and for Marvin Miller to really go to work. So at first, for Marvin Miller, it was small battles like that. It was the players' rights to their own likeness and marketing deals that would pay for office space, and then eventually to start to move into the TV revenue questions, because the owners were continuing to go with that. So making sure the TV revenue was secure to pay for the pension, and then going on into with expansion, the 1969 expansion, of course. Anybody who's worked at all with finances and pensions knows, well, if you're expanding, you're going to have more workers. And if you have a fixed pension fund, you've got to cover more workers. That's not necessarily going to work. So Miller saw the players through, making sure that the pension would cover that expanded pool of workers, especially because costs were really rising at the time in the late 60s. And I had a good chance, Ian, not to name drop, but living out here in Thousand Oaks, California, Tigers and Reds fans might remember that Sparky Anderson had made his home here for many, many years. He moved out to Thousand Oaks into the neighborhood that I grew up in 1966, when he got his first minor league managing job, and just stayed. They liked the area. His family was happy here, and Sparky loved it, and they just stayed. And later on, he and my parents and eventually we became good friends, and I had a good chance to talk to Sparky about this when I was just starting to play around with the concept. So this would have been in like 2003 and 2004-ish. And I sat down with Sparky, and we talked for about an hour, and he said, once Marvin won the first round, in other words, once Marvin told the players, you do X and we'll get Y, and it worked, he said after that, the players pretty much, what Marvin said, they just did. Because for the first time sort of in their history, they had a leader who knew how to work against the owners and would guide them in a way that would allow them to get some of the things they wanted. Again, starting with things like the pension and the healthcare plan and improvement in minimum salaries, but eventually the ultimate goal, just as it had been ever since the 1890s, the ultimate goal was to get away from the reserve clause and to get what we call free agency. And so that's where, after securing the pension and achieving some of those other gains in minimum salaries and those kinds of things, there's this move in the early 70s to start to really focus in on free agency, the elimination of the reserve clause. And so that's where the book turns from there.
And when you think about it, I mean, if Marvin Miller came in 1966 regarding, the chairperson of the MLBPA, it took him 10 years to get to the reserve clause, and it was only through, and we'll get to that, a few decisions. But the main thing is, I think, and I want you to describe this, he believed in fighting the owners with collective bargaining.
Right. And that's where really he was a step ahead of the owners the whole way, because he could keep the players unified. The owners, I mean, we can only imagine, right? And again, I don't want to sound like I don't understand where they're coming from, because I get it. Obviously, again, any business owner is going to want to keep their costs as low as possible. And any business owner is going to be nervous about some kind of big change, especially the small market clubs who are worried about revenue streams and those kinds of things. But so one advantage Marvin had was being able to keep the players together. Another one was that the owners had so many sort of different points of view, and a lot of these guys were pretty ego-driven, and they were very successful in other businesses. And so they weren't necessarily in a hurry to work collectively amongst themselves. Especially the small market clubs could not afford big stoppages, right? They could not afford big strikes or lockouts or any of those kinds of things. So on the one hand, you have a lot of those small market owners who need to make this go. And then you have guys like Gussie Busch, who's got all the Anheuser-Busch money behind him, who can kind of fire away and, be a firebrand and kind of disrupt things. So obviously for the person negotiating on behalf of the owners, they had a much more difficult job. The second thing is Miller, again, coming out of the United Steelworkers, had such a strong background in industrial relations. Like, he knew, as you say, Ian, he knew how to get things done through collective bargaining. And so out of the Curt Flood case, for example, which is another big part of this, when Curt Flood takes his challenge to the Supreme Court, Miller basically gets the owners to say in court that we will resolve all of these things through collective bargaining. And once the owners commit to that, Marvin's got him right where he wants him, because that's his arena. That's where he's going to do so well, is in collective bargaining. And so that's really, kind of how things turn and why they go the way they do.
And the collective bargaining agreements of 68 and 69 opens the way for a higher salary for the players. I think, if my numbers serve me correct, a 43% increase in the minimum salary from $7,000 to $10,000.
Right.
Which by today's standard is absurd.
Well, and just, obviously the numbers, I should have looked at an inflation calculator before I got on the air, because I like to be able to put things in contemporary dollars, but I think we all understand that even $10,000 in 1970, you're not talking about multiple millions of dollars now, like a lot of players are making. Now, obviously the revenue streams aren't the same either, but you can imagine what a small percentage of the overall revenue that was, and really a guy in a good paying factory job in 1970, he's making more than $7,000 or $8,000 a year. So a lot of the guys working for the major league minimum were making less than their peers who had these sort of higher paying industrial jobs or a good construction job, for example. And those are all good, honorable lines of work. I don't mean to disparage any of those at all. But what the players had that the guys working construction or in factories or whatever didn't have was this incredibly specialized skill set, right? And when we like to talk about free market economics in the United States and those kinds of things, if you have something that's incredibly specialized and incredibly valuable, if you can hit major league pitching, which we know there are very few people who can do, who can do that, then a free market economy says, well, be paid accordingly, especially when you're in an industry that's generating, billions of dollars a year. Now, back then it would have been millions of dollars a year. But, I think absolutely that minimum salary along with the pension, like I said, and securing those things were the first orders of business in 68 and 69, and sort of getting the players used to this idea of collective bargaining and being more militant and really sticking together and having some unity. It's escaping me if it was 68 or 69. It was one of the lockouts. A few guys still signed contracts. But then after that got resolved successfully for the union, that was pretty much it. They really had zero problems with any kind of solidarity amongst the players after that.
And, more importantly, the 68 and 69 contracts, it did really bring a formal structure to owner-player relations in that you're going to write procedures for arbitration and grievances, which would come before the commissioner, which we'll talk about either on this show or next. Bowie Kuhn, who Marvin Miller said, if no Bowie Kuhn, we wouldn't have gotten as far as we would have. But it also set up the next 3-year deal in 1970, where we had arbitrators now, where the players did have a voice now to argue their salaries.
Right, and arbitration becomes key, both for the salary piece, but also especially for the grievance piece, because eventually the players, of course, are going to, after the Flood decision, the players are going to start pushing free agency into the arbitration process. And ultimately that's where they'll get the victory they're looking for. First we'll have some kind of, not half-hearted, but kind of these funny little free agent situations, right? With Catfish Hunter, for example, who basically, because Charlie Finley, he's speaking of parsimonious owners, Charlie Finley of the A's, doesn't keep up on the annuity payments on Catfish Hunter's contract. And Catfish Hunter's able to say, hey, he violated the terms of my contract. I'm no longer bound to play for the A's next year. You might remember better than me and how well that worked out for the Yankees. But, he was sort of he was a one-off And again, Catfish Hunter, for those of you that aren't familiar, he's that kind of pitcher. Maybe not quite a Koufax, but pretty darn close. And he was on the free market. It was this real rare opportunity, right, where we could test sort of the value of what is a pitcher like that worth. And he was paid very handsomely, and went to New York and continued to have a very successful career. So there were these little trial balloon kind of things. And then finally, and maybe I'm jumping ahead of where you want to go, Ian, but it's through that process with Peter Seitz as the arbitrator, that the players are able to win the right to actual free agency, and they get there through the efforts of a couple guys, Dave McNally and Andy Messerschmidt, two pitchers who actually play a whole season without a new contract, and that frees them up. They become then essentially that frees them from the reserve clause because they didn't ever sign a new contract. They played under the terms of the old contract, finished the season, were released, and the grievance then becomes, well, they should be able to go negotiate. And when Seitz rules in their favor, that really sets the stage. They're ready to go. They're able to get out there and negotiate. McNally, of course, would just join the grievance for solidarity. He was towards the end of his career. But for Messerschmidt, it was huge. He was at the prime of his career. He was ready to get paid. He was trying to think of a good contemporary example. I think a lot about so many of those guys on that Royals team that won the World Series, and how many of them will be looking to get paid here in the next few years because they're very promising young players who are going to be able to have their first big free agent signing. Well, that's essentially where Messerschmidt was in 1976.
His timing was right. Now, let's get into the Curt Flood case, because I don't think we're going to finish everything in this show anyway. We got about 10 minutes, and to tell you the truth, I like dissecting this in pieces because I think it's very important to the listeners to understand step by step leading up to the dissolution of the reserve clause. But let's take a look at Curt Flood. Let's describe for us what was going on with Curt Flood and how the case at the Supreme Court had an impact on baseball.
So Flood, many people remember, was a very talented outfielder for those really strong Cardinal teams through the 60s, the Bob Gibson Cardinals, if you will. And so in 1970, before the 1970 season, he gets traded. He gets traded to the Phillies. Now, this is going to sound kind of funny, but given maybe the way those cities operate now, but at the time, Philadelphia was not a place a lot of black players wanted to go play. Number one, the Phillies weren't nearly as good as the Cardinals. That mattered to Flood. Number two, he felt at home in St. Louis and enjoyed the atmosphere there and felt very comfortable there. There was much better interracial relationships in St. Louis between the players and the media and each other and everything else, and it was more contentious in Philadelphia. He didn't want to get stuck with a loser. He didn't want to go to a place that wasn't very receptive. And he felt like this was a violation of his 13th Amendment rights, that being traded against his will because of the reserve clause, because he was basically being treated like a piece of property by the Cardinals, was a violation of his rights. So Flood decided, with the support of the MLBPA, and this was a very big thing for the MLBPA. Keep in mind, if we go back to that timeline you've been so good at establishing, Ian, that this is just 4 years into Marvin Miller. So it's just 2 or 3 years after the players have really started to kind of gain a sense of solidarity and momentum. And so Flood comes in to the MLBPA, and they've got a lot of questions for him. Are you just a troublemaker? Are you doing this just to get publicity? What are your motivations? And after a lot of soul searching and talking, they figure out that he's the guy. He's the guy that should do this. They hire as his attorney, and I can't believe I'm blanking on this right now, but he was a former justice of the Supreme Court. He'd been, and he left the Supreme Court to be on Johnson's cabinet. I can't believe I'm blanking on this. Anyway.
That's all right. I got you. Arthur Goldberg.
Arthur Goldberg. There you go. I was going to say gold something. I wasn't sure if I was going to get the Goldberg right.
That's right. You're talking to a lawyer who specialized in Supreme Court cases.
Well, so there you go. So Arthur Goldberg, they bring Arthur Goldberg in, who's obviously a real heavy hitter and somebody who's going to do the best by Flood. They spend a lot of time carefully examining his case, and the chance to go to the Supreme Court basically becomes what the players are hoping for, because it's going to force the owners to show a lot of their cards. And it's also this really formative moment for Bowie Kuhn, who's working his hardest to ascend to the commissionership. And basically, in the way that the owners try to protect the reserve clause, they essentially set themselves up to, again, commit to resolving the reserve clause through negotiations, through collective bargaining, and ultimately through the arbitration process. But the Flood case plays out in front of the public, and when the Supreme Court comes back, they rule in favor of the owners. But again, the owners have now committed to resolving the issues of the case through collective bargaining. And the case is also very instrumental in terms of demonstrating just how deeply within the American public people did not take Major League Baseball seriously as a business. Even in the way the opinions are written, you can tell the Supreme Court justices are huge baseball fans. They have this idea that baseball is this community treasure. It's this thing that belongs to the people, and it's this thing that is exceptional, and therefore they're totally looking past the individual rights of the players, and they're totally looking past some of the basic principles of free market economics, because they're holding on to it again with all these romantic notions, and they're not looking at it for the business that it is, and they're not looking at Major League Baseball as the monopoly that it is. And really, again, still to this day, it operates very much like a monopoly in many ways. The Flood case is absolutely critical, and it plays out between 1970 and 1972 before we finally get a ruling in the case. And Flood, you can only imagine what public opinion was like on Flood. There was obviously support, but there was also a lot of very negative reaction. I mean, we can only imagine how Curt Flood would have been attacked on Twitter, right?
Oh, geez.
You know what I mean? Especially people hiding behind the anonymity of Twitter, and certainly race would have been a factor. Keep in mind, this is playing out against the later stages of the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers are very active at this point in time. Not that Flood was a Black Panther or some kind of militant, but he certainly was a civil rights activist in his own way and believed in the civil rights movement. But that was a lot of what was going around in the public discourse around these kinds of things at the time. So, who's this uppity so-and-so? I think we can kind of imagine how that would have played out.
Yeah, and you know what, Krister, I'm going to end my inquiries here at the Flood case because there's so much more to talk about, and I just can't rush going through this. The other steps from 72, from 70 to 76, we're going to talk about the public's opinion on the next show. We're going to talk about who was Bowie Kuhn and why was it instrumental that under his leadership all these things happen. We're going to get into the Sykes rulings. We're going to get into Messerschmitt, and we're going to get into Catfish. There's so much more to talk about, including how Miller sets up right after the Flood case for the 72 lightning strike. But we have so much to talk about, and this is too important to just rush. I hope you don't mind that I end the inquiry here.
No, not at all. Not at all. I'll look forward to talking to you next time.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is, I know my co-pilot is listening. I heard him come in, but again, he can't talk. And this is a subject which he is very excited about, which the listeners are very excited about. We're going to get into that next time. What I'll do is I'll email you, like I did, to get you back on the show. I know Marc wants to do the show because this is something that he's wanted to do, and I think he's asked for your book. I don't know if you received it.
Yeah, the press is sending him a copy.
Yeah, so I want him to read it. Like I told the listeners, fascinating book. This is very important. We'll get you back on the show. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this segment of Genesis. Very important topic. It explains a lot on how the players and the unions and the owners here were formulating, sidelines, if you will, general lines of defense and offense, and there's a lot of political stuff, almost what's going on today, like we mentioned earlier, what's going on. So stay tuned for a part 2 with Mr. Swanson. We'll have him back on the show. Krister, hold the line. This is how I end the show. Folks, we're going to see you next time. Hope you enjoyed the show, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.